Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Tuesday.
Yeah,
Yeah,
couple Tuesdays before the holiday.
that's right. Yeah, this has been a holiday unlike any other I have ever lived through.
For real.
But we're all hanging in there. I hope you guys are hanging in there too. So last week we talked all about end of year money moves, particularly for real estate investors, and with an emphasis on tax moves to help lower your tax bill for 2020. This week, we're going to jump into how to safely rent to tenants with bad credit, particularly if you're having a hard time renting out a vacant property. This is a difficult time of year to fill vacancies. Not that many people want to move during the holidays. It's a hectic enough time of year.
Especially in
So,
the cities.
yeah, very difficult time to fill urban vacancies right now between COVID and just it being the holidays. So if you're having a hard time renting out your vacant unit, often landlords will turn to tenants with weaker credit. All right, they'll loosen up their tenant screening standards. So as you guys join us, let us know where you are tuning in from, and what kind of trouble you're having with vacancies, if any. Or maybe you're having a perfectly pleasant experience with your rental properties right now, but let us know what is going on with you. And Denny, so what are some of the things that landlords can do to protect themselves against rent defaults or other tenant problems if they are loosening their tenant screening standards, maybe accepting applicants with a lower credit score?
Well, I think one of the first things is you can't have both. So you don't want a lower credit score and not great income. That's just bad right there. As much as you might want to help somebody or whatever, you got to make sure your rent is covered. So if it's somebody who has really good income and maybe some credit issues, maybe check their credit issues and make sure that, none of the big red flags are up. Some of the things, like if a cell phone bill shows up on a credit report, more often than not, that indicates somebody that probably is going to let rent go if the going gets tough. Um, and if it's a credit report that just has issues with, like, maybe there's health bills on there, but everything else is on time and everything else, they might be somebody to consider. Definitely don't just look at a score, because there's so much behind the score. Um, and that's helpful.
Yeah, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into one thing that you said. You were talking about um, like health bills, medical bills on someone's credit versus ongoing recurring payments like cell phone bills. So that is one thing that I look at as a landlord when I'm reviewing tenant screening reports and credit reports is there an isolated incident, a one-time incident where something out of the ordinary happened to throw off this person's finances, such as a divorce or a medical crisis? Um, or is there a pattern of not paying their bills on time? So, I mean, that's a huge distinction because I'm of the opinion that there are basically two types of people in this world. There are people who pay every bill on time, come hell or high water, who are fundamentally responsible with money and who are mortified at the very thought of missing a payment. And then there are people who never saw a bill they wanted to pay on time in their life. So, you have to read between the lines a little bit when you're looking at these credit reports and look
Right.
at,
And I,
is
I
this
just
someone
want
with
to
a sustained
interject.
history?
I disagree with you a little bit. I do think there's middle ground there. I think there are people that have been hit by, whether it's a health issue or like COVID, and they are somebody who has paid on time all the time. And then unfortunately, stuff happens. But as landlords, we have to really we can't look at it emotionally.
Well,
Um,
that's my point, is that, is it someone with a sustained pattern of not paying their bills on time, or is it someone who got completely thrown off by a once in a lifetime incident like a divorce that threw off their finances, but they
right.
otherwise have a clean pattern of paying their bills on time? So you have to read credit reports with a little bit of nuance and not just look at the score, to your point, Denny.
And listen to your applicants when you're talking to them on the phone. Don't just, like, I mean, really pardon me, I have dogs in the background. They're gonna
No,
make
I have both
noise.
twice.
But anyway, your applicants will tell a story and be very, very mindful of what they're saying, because you'll see lies creep up in their credit report. I've seen that before. And they'll say, "Oh, I've never been late," and then you'll see, "Oh, they're always late." So I mean, it's good to just listen to all of the little keys and whatnot. We do have a question from Calvin DeGrasse. I hope I made that okay. I hope I said that okay. And it's, what if it's Section 8, so the rent is mostly guaranteed?
Go ahead, Deni.
So the Section 8 can be very good, but it's something that's not going to help you in the midst of like COVID, where we're having some situations where we have more people that are having trouble with rent. It's a long-term solution because you go through inspections and a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of red tape.
I mean, initially to
Yeah,
move
to
someone
get
in.
involved. And once you're in there, it's good. But if you do get a tough tenant in there, it's really, really hard to get them out or to get damages covered. So there are the good in Section 8 is, yes, the rent is mostly guaranteed. The negatives are you can end up with a rough tenant or somebody who has made some damages to your unit, and that becomes very hard to recoup.
Yeah, my experience with Section 8 tenants has been that they don't treat your property nearly as well because they're not on the hook for most of the rent. And we value what costs something from us, right? I mean, that's why we always want people to have skin in the game. And Section 8 tenants don't have that much skin in the game, so they don't put that much value in the house that they're living in, your property.
Right.
Now, that's a generalization, of course. I did an interview a few months back with a guy who specializes in buying Section 8 properties in DC. And he basically said that, in his experience, there's two types of Section 8 renters. There are people who are very grateful to have that, to participate in that program and have those benefits, and who want to do everything they can to keep those benefits, and they have an attitude of gratitude about it. And then there are people who are entitled and have that entitlement mindset and think that they deserve this, and that they are entitled to whatever they want.
Right.
So some of that tenant screening process when you're dealing with Section 8 tenants is trying to get to the root of what kind of person are you renting to. And I also like to go and look at their current residence and see how they treat it, to get a little bit of insight into that as well. And you still want to do the other tenant screening as well, checking their income, checking their
Oh,
credit, because
absolutely.
they are on the hook for some of the money. And if they don't pay their portion, you still have to evict them, and it takes longer to evict a Section 8 tenant than a market tenant. So
And I
something to
remember
consider.
way back when I when I got involved in property management, and we had a few Section 8 tenants, and a lot of them were young single moms who were going to school to try to better themselves. And you can get like, you can see if it's that, you can see if somebody is working on themselves, and generally they will make a better renter for you on Section 8 than somebody who clearly is just kind of riding on the system.
Right. Right. Now, Denny, what about things on the credit report like bankruptcies, evictions, judgments, some of these public records? What are your thoughts on those as a landlord reading these rental applications and credit reports?
Um, Bankruptcies, I think it's a case by case basis. To be honest with you, I'd rather have a bankruptcy on somebody's credit now than have them go through a bankruptcy when they're renting from me, because that's a whole other pain in
Right.
the butt.
Right. And you can't
um,
declare bankruptcy back to back.
right.
There's a many years long waiting period. I think it's 7 years.
Yeah.
Could be 10 years.
I just remember trying to evict somebody who had a bankruptcy while they were in the apartment, and it was a nightmare to try to get them out. So I don't think a bankruptcy anyway is as a bad, as long you want to obviously have all the other um, everything lining up. Check their credit report. I mean, you can still tell if somebody is claiming a bankruptcy, but they still have some credit and they're still paying some of their bills on time. Evictions, I'm not a fan. And I've heard so many different excuses, my boyfriend did it, or my girlfriend ruined the apartment, or a whole bunch. And they could be true or not, but more often than not, again, I'm going to go back to when I was young and very naive in this business and listen to the stories, because I was all about the emotions, and I got screwed basically. So you know, if they've had an eviction once, they could have an eviction again. And the last thing you want to deal with is a professional tenant that knows the ins and outs of a system.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've had professional tenants, and it's taken me a year to get them out. They know every loophole in the book to stay on the property. So to me, evictions get to the root of what you're looking for with tenant screening. In tenant screening, you're trying to just discover, is this person someone who is going to break my lease or not? And if they have been evicted before, it means that they broke someone else's lease, in which case they are more likely to break your lease. So I do not rent to anyone who has an eviction on their record,
Right.
period. Now, bankruptcies and judgments, like you said, Deni, there's more room for um, interpretation there,
Hmm.
more wiggle room for someone going through a one-time hardship, like we were talking about earlier with their credit report. So you want to look at, was there a one-time hardship, like a divorce, like a medical emergency? I'm much lighter on medical judgments than I am on judgments from unpaid bills. If someone had unpaid bills that went to debt collection and went to a judgment, that is a sign of an ongoing problem. Whereas a medical judgment, I mean, that could be a one-time incident, one-time hardship. So,
Absolutely.
all right. Now, what about bringing in someone else to co-sign on behalf of someone with bad credit? What are your thoughts on that? Is that effective? What are the risks?
It's effective if you take it all the way. Like, some people will get a cosigner, they'll have them sign a lease and that's it. And you don't really have any um, guidelines on what is that person responsible for and whatnot. So again, I'm sorry about this. You want to make sure that you have an agreement with the cosigner, and the cosigner knows that they are on the hook, not even just for unpaid rent, but they are also on the hook for damage to the apartment and everything else. Because if they're going to vouch for this person, you want to make sure they are vouching for this person, like they're putting themselves on the line. If somebody cosigns for a car and they ruin the car, that person still is liable for their car. The same would be for an apartment or a rental.
Yeah, and one other point to add in there is that with co-signers, they're just as legally liable as the tenant. So you need to screen them just like you would screen any tenant who's going to move into the property. Because if the co-signer has no income and bad credit, then what's the point? You're not gonna be able to collect
Right.
from them either. So you have to screen tenants, or sorry, screen co-signers as if they're tenants moving into the property. And like Deni mentioned in passing, they need to sign on the lease as well, as fully legally liable for
And
the
keep
terms
in
of that lease.
mind that your co-signers, not only are they going to be responsible for the rent on this rental, but chances are they either have a mortgage or another rental. So you want to make sure that their whole picture, they can take care of it all, because potentially it could come down to that.
Right. Now, what about collecting extra money in the form of a security deposit? Does that work? I mean, what are the limits on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you can collect. A lot of people do it. It's very common. A lot of states don't allow it, but I see people still doing it, which is the last month rent in advance. Um, and let's face it, one of your favorite terms is, if you have more money in the game, isn't that what you say all the time?
Well, more skin in the
More
game
skin in
helps
the
help
game.
keep people accountable.
Right. And that's true. If people have more money on the line, they're going to be less apt to, you know, they're going to listen, follow the rules and whatnot, because they're not going to want to lose that money. Um, but there's some caveats with that. I mean, if you take somebody who pays you 6 months of rent in advance, it can be a little bit harder depending on your state and locality to get them out of there. So just you got to weigh all that out. I don't think I would take much more than 2 months of rent in advance. That's
even
just
if they
me.
offer it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, one other option that has emerged in the last couple of years is rent default insurance. So tell us a little bit about that, how it works, where people can learn more about that.
Well, we have worked with Steady and some other ones, and it's a great program. Um, I wish it was out, back when I was managing big, large apartment complexes. It sure would have saved my butt several times. But it protects the landlord because you can have the best tenant and that looks great on paper, and you meet them and they're wonderful people and just takes them down. It could be a breakup in a relationship and somebody just forgets they just get depressed. They don't want to do anything. They don't pay their rent. They don't pay their bills. And then you're stuck. But you're not with this default insurance. It pays basically. I forget. It pays. Is it 75 or 80%?
No, they pay the entire rent until you have the tenant out of the unit and replace them with a paying tenant. So if the tenant stops paying the rent, the insurance kicks in and starts making the rent payments to you until you've replaced them with a paying tenant. And
And
it's
it's
not
kind
super
of a
expensive.
win-win, really.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, the average policy costs a few $100s a year, somewhere in the 350 to $450 a year range, and it lets you sleep at night as a landlord,
Yes. And especially
knowing
we
that.
all see this now, like with COVID. Again, perfectly great tenants have gone through some really tough times. If you were in the entertainment industry, you really um
Oh, sure,
you were
hospitality.
affected.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it protects the landlord in those circumstances, especially with eviction moratoriums and all this stuff.
yeah. So I put a link in the comments to where you can learn more about steady rent default insurance, and we'll also put a link here to where you can run some tenant screening reports, including a full credit report, nationwide criminal background check, and a nationwide eviction history report. Denny, is there anything else that you want to cover before we call this episode complete?
Well, I know that you mentioned going by and looking at their current residence because that's going to at least tell you whether they're going to ruin yours or not, or take care of it or not. But I would definitely look back and check on prior landlord references and not just the one that they're in now. I would go back and check a
Right.
couple
Because their
just to make
current
sure.
landlord might tell you whatever it takes just to get them out of their hair,
Hmm.
right? If they're a nightmare tenant. Whereas the previous landlords who have already gotten rid of them, they'll tell it to you straight.
Right.
Um,
And
and
you know
one
what?
other
Check
thing,
their social media accounts.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. You can learn a lot about someone nowadays online. And I also like to speak not just with the HR department for their employer to verify their income and how long they've worked there, but I also like to speak with their direct supervisor because they can tell you about their character. What kind of person are they? Do they show up to work on time every single day with a good attitude? Do they work hard, or do they always show up late, reeking of booze? I mean,
Right.
you can tell, and they are not legally obligated to talk to you, but many will. I mean, many people are happy to talk to you. So try to speak with their direct supervisor and just ask open-ended questions and get a sense for what kind of person you're dealing with.
And again, remember this is for the I mean, you want to really keep your standards high if you're in an area where apartments are just rentals are just going, they're renting. And that they haven't really been affected and things are rolling even in this holiday season. But when you get into some locations and urban has been really hit bad lately, you probably will have to rest some of your specifications, and maybe credit may have to be lowered a little bit, maybe income even a little bit, not so much that you are going to stretch them so thin that they won't be able to afford it, and then that's just on you. But credit sometimes, but look at the whole picture.
Yeah, and worst case scenario, you can always turn to Airbnb. All right, guys. Well, on that note, we will see you next Tuesday at 2 o'clock Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Send us your questions and comments for what you want to hear about next week, and we will see you then.
Have a great week.